guys, welcome to the third episode of our Reactive Angular course. In the previous episode, we've seen some basic support for RxJS in Angular. We've talked about nsync pipe and how to consume observables in the template. In this episode, we'll start looking at some RxJS operators, and we will use them to implement a bit more complex scenarios. So in the previous lesson, we had a grid showing some data loaded from the backend. In this lesson, we are going to add some more features to this grid. We are going to add a button which the user can use to refresh the data, and we will also add a loading indicator which shows the user whenever the data is being loaded from the server. Let's get to work. Okay, we are looking again at the source code of our application. So far it can fetch some data from the server side and display it in a grid, in a HTML table. What we are going to do now is add a button, and when the user clicks on that button, they will trigger the reload of the data, so that the user can get the latest version of data to be displayed in the table. Let's start with the simplest thing, so we will just add some HTML to display the button. We'll wrap everything in a bootstrap form group, and inside we put a button. Should indicate its type, that's a regular button. As a label, we can just put refresh data. And we can also add some bootstrap classes for the look and feel to make the button look nice. So now with the traditional approach, we would put a click event binding here, and inside we would call some methods on the component. So something like refresh data. And inside this method, we would trigger the call to the server side. But we are now into the reactive programming paradigm, so we are going to look at it differently. So actually, clicks in the user interface, clicks on this particular button, can be looked at as a stream, a reactive stream, a stream of events, and these events being button clicks. Since it's a stream, we can represent it as an observable and do some transformations with it. But how to make an observable that emits whenever the user clicks on that button? There are actually a couple of ways to do this. One is to use observable from event static method. For this, we would need to inject the button into the component using the viewChild decorator, and that would introduce a dependency on the DOM model, HTML. So we are going to take the second approach, and we are going to create a subject. So what are subjects? Subjects are like observables, but you can actually control them. You can take a subject and emit data on it, emit events. So it's an observable that can be controlled externally. That's a bit of a simplification, but it should be sufficient for now. So let's see by an example. I think the example will explain the best what subjects are. Maybe let's remove this refresh data event binding here. We will come back and fill these quotes later. Let's jump to the component and let's add a new field. We will call it refresh data click subject. And we will initialize it with a new subject, which is imported, as you can see, from RxJS/subject. And subject is an observable, so with observable we provide the type parameter. So we could also do it here. If we don't, the implicit is just empty object, as you can see. And it's fine for us because we are not interested in the data emitted by this observable. We are only interested in the actual events, that the fact that the subject emits something. So now I mentioned that with a subject you can control it, you can emit data on it externally, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we can copy this long name and paste it here inside our click binding and call .next. So this will actually cause our subject to emit an event. Okay, we can now quickly test it. So inside the constructor, let's take our subject, and as you can see, it has a method asObservable. So let's call it and assign a result to a field, a variable with a name indicating that that's a regular observable. So you can just call it according to the finish notation, refresh data, click $. And now we can take this new observable and subscribe to it just for the moment, and console log whenever somebody emits an event on this subject, whenever this observable emits an event. In fact, we no longer care at this point what is the source of events on this observable. So let me save the file and jump to the browser. And of course, let's have a look at the developer tools. Here in the console, it's empty now, but as soon as I click on the button, I start seeing messages, these click messages. So we can see that our subject turned to observable is actually emitting events. Cool. Let's get back to the code. And what we are going to do now is actually implement the logic we wanted in the first place. So just to remind you, we want this button is supposed to refresh the data. So whenever the user clicks on the button, we should fetch the data from the server. First, let's get rid of this code. And now we have this bundle is observable, and we know that it is used in the template as the source of the data. So if we want to do anything with the bundle list of bonds, we need to do something with this observable. We just need to modify the way it is created. We cannot just subscribe and introduce some more fields. We actually, all our modifications have to do something to this observable because it is the only source of bond list in the template. We know that now this observable will be involved, right? Because we want to fetch the data whenever the user clicks. So whenever this one emits an event. We are already familiar with the map operator. So for map operator, for every event emitted by the source observable, we can apply a function that does something to that value. So it kind of sounds like what you want to do here, right? Because for every click of the user, we want to map this click into the list of bonds from the server side. So let's write it down. Let's get rid of this, and we start with the refresh data click stream, and we call pipe in order to apply some transformations on it. And let's try with map first. So we import map, and inside we should provide the mapping function. And the mapping function usually takes a value and returns a new value. But in our case, we don't care about the value because it's an empty object. We only care about the fact that the button was clicked. And what we would like to return, we would like to return the new fresh band list from the server side, right? So we just map this empty value to banddataService.getBands. Okay, so this seems reasonable, right? But TypeScript is complaining here, and let's have a look why. So it's saying the types are wrong because it's expecting observable of band list, and what it gets is observable of band list. So what we have created here is like a nested observable inside observable. So something's wrong here, right? Because we are supposed to deliver a flat observable, just an observable of list of bands. And the reason for that is that we've used the map operator, and we have to do something more than mapping, because mapping will convert every value emitted by the source observable to a new observable. So in fact, we get indeed an observable of observables. So we also want to somehow merge the observables, the inner observables, the observables emitted by this mapping function. And for that we can use another RxJS operator called MergeMap. It's also imported from RxJS/operators. And now the types are fine, as you can see. So what just happened here? Once again, in essence, what we want to do is map these clicks to list of bands. That's why we went for map operator. But actually it turns out that getBands method doesn't return a list of bands. It returns an observable. So for every initial click we emit a whole new observable. So we have to merge all these observables to end up with a simple observable of band arrays. Okay, let's save it and verify that this solution works. So let's go to the browser. And it seems something went wrong. The page is just showing loading. So let's have a quick look at our template. And what we have here is this ngIf on band list. So unless band list emits anything, this expression will evaluate to false, and ngIf will decide to use this ng template instead of this whole piece of HTML. And if you think of it, the behavior is actually correct, because our band list observable, if we look at it, it starts with the refresh data click stream. So unless there is a button click on that button, this observable will not emit anything, right? We forgot that this is not the only source of refresh in the application. We want the data to be loaded on button clicks, but we also want it to be loaded initially. So this is actually quite easy to fix, because as I said, we start with this refresh data click stream, but we can use another RxJS operator called start with, and we will start with just an empty object. So what we are saying is take this stream of clicks, but initiate it with an empty object representing a click actually. So in other words, we don't want to wait for this guy to actually emit anything. we want this observable to emit something initially, and only after that we will handle all these clicks. And we want to emit something initially because we wanted the data to be loaded in the first place when the user opens the page. So let's now save it and have a look at the browser. And now, as you can see, the data is there. And if I click on the button, actually only inside the console I can see that there is some round trip to the server. So the data is being fetched from the server. Cool, so we've got this working. However, there is now a small issue because the loading indicator. When we load the page, we can see the loading string initially. However, if I click on the refresh data button, I no longer see the loading indicator. And let's say we have a requirement to display this loading indicator whenever the data is being loaded from the server. So we are going to fix it now. Let's go back to the code and have a look at the template. So far we were taking care of loading indicator using this ng-if-else statement, directive actually. And this will no longer work because ng-if is based on that if this expression does not emit, so it evaluates to false, then it will use this loading template. But in our case, when we trigger the refresh of data, the observable has already emitted some data, so it will not evaluate to false. So this template will not be shown. Therefore, we will use another mechanism. We will basically drive this showing of loading indicator manually. Let's have a look at the component. And now we have this band list stream which emits arrays of bands. And we would like to actually deliver a bit more information to the component now, to the template now. Not just the array of bands, but we would also like to deliver a flag, a Boolean flag indicating whether we are loading something or not. So we will change the type of this slightly, and we'll change it to object with two properties. The first will be called bands, and its type will be array of band. And the second one, the new one, will be called isLoading, and it will be a Boolean. Okay, but now the name of the observable is no longer meaningful because it's not just the band list. Let's change it to something more generic. Let's just call it model, because it is the model, the stream of models for our template. Okay, so now, of course, the type is wrong, but there is also something else, because this, what we had so far, only emitted an event when there was some data coming back from the server. But we didn't emit an event when we actually triggered the operation, the reload operation. And now we want an observable that emits an event both when we start loading something from the server, when we trigger the reload, and when the data is back from the server. So we need to refactor things here a bit. What we're going to do first is introduce a new observable, and we will call it refresh trigger stream. And we will construct it from the click stream. We will just also combine it with this start with. So what this observable means is it's a stream of refresh triggers. So it emits whenever there is a need to refresh the data in our view. And so far in our case, there are only two situations. So initially we want to refresh the data because of the start with, and we also want to refresh it whenever a user clicks on a button. So now we can get rid of this guy here and just use the new refresh trigger stream. Okay, so now we have an observable that emits whenever we trigger loading of data, and we kind of have the observable that emits whenever the server responds. And as I said, we want an observable that emits in both of these situations. So what we can do is simply merge both of these observables. So merging two observables will take two streams and create a new stream that emits all events from the first observable and the second observable. As simple as that. So how to merge two observables? We are going to import the merge function from RxJS /observable/merge. And now we are going to construct this model stream by calling merge on refresh trigger stream and this guy. Actually, for clarity, let's maybe take this guy and create a new observable. We can actually call it, use the name that we used to have before, so bandlist stream. Yeah, so we have the first observable, which emits whenever we trigger the refresh, and we have the bandlist observable, which emits whenever the list of bands is replied by the server. So when we merge these observables, we will have a new observable that emits first when there is a refresh trigger, and then when the data comes back from the server. Cool, we're almost there. The problem is that this observable emits empty objects, and this observable emits list of bands. So we somehow have to make the return types of these observables consistent. And for that we can use the map function. So let's start with this guy. We call pipe on it, and inside we pass the map function, which takes the array of bands and returns. It has to return an object that according to this interface here. So it has to have a bands field, and we will of course use the bands variable passed to the mapping function, and it has to have is loading flag. So whenever the data comes back from the server, it means that we are no longer loading the data. So we'll just use false here. And for this observable, we are again going to call map on it. And now we map this empty events to the new object. So for bands, we are going to use an empty array, because since we are triggering a new data refresh, we just forget about all the bands that we currently have loaded, and we await for the new bands. And we will also put isLoading set to true here, because we have just begun a new loading operation. So we want to set loading to true. Okay, there is some small issue with nesting here. So yeah, I've missed one more parenthesis, and this looks fine now. Okay, we just need to adjust the template. So let's go to the HTML. And now inside our ngIf, we no longer subscribe to bond list, but to the model stream. And we use the alias model. And let's get rid of this else loading thing, because we are going to handle loading indication manually now. So now we have our observable unwrapped. So inside the ng4 we can just use model.bonds, which will either have the array of bonds if it came from the server, or an empty array, in which case it will not display any rows. And above we will add a new row in which we can just put some very basic loading indicator, just a string, and we will only show it if model.isLoading is true. And I hope this makes sense, that we only want to show the loading indicator if the part of our state says that we are currently being loading the data. Cool, so let's test this solution. Let's go to the browser and let's maybe reload. So initially we can see the loading indicator, and now if I click on refresh data, we can again see the loading indicator, so it seems to work fine. We can do one more nice thing here. So if we are loading the data, we might actually disable the button that triggers loading of data, right? Because it doesn't make sense to click it again. So what we're going to do is add a property binding on disabled, and we'll use our model.isLoading. So if we are loading, we want to disable the button. Let's test the solution. And we could see that it was initially disabled. Now if I click, it's disabled, so I cannot really click on it until the data comes back from the server. And finally, instead of showing this piece of text, we can show a nice graphical loading indicator. So I'm going to take this GIF and move it to assets and rename it to loader.gif. And inside the template, instead of this piece of text, I'm going to put an img tag with links to assets/loader.gif. And I will also add some styling to make sure that text align is center. Let's do a final test. Oh, something's wrong with the button, with the icon. And yeah, that's the extension. So it's actually GIF, not Git. Okay, so now we could initially see the nice loading indicator. And when I click on the button, again, I can see the loader being displayed. Cool. So that was it for this episode. Let's maybe wrap it up by having a look again at the whole construction we have here inside the component, because it's starting to look quite complex. But this is how reactive programming looks. We take some primitive observables such as refresh data click, and we start building upon them. So from it we create the refresh stringer, and from it we create bond list stream, and then we take both of them and kind of combine them with merge to end up with a single observable that we pass to our template. And inside our template we unwrap this observable and then just use it normally. So we access properties on the model. And that's it. Great! In this episode, we have started learning about some important RxJS operators. In the next episode, we'll learn about even more of them, and we'll use them to make our application more reactive and to add more and more features to it. See you in the next episode!